I'm Chris Lubienski at the University of Illinois. I look at education policy and politics. I'm particularly interested in the political economy of education, meaning kind of the optimal roles of public and private interests and institutions in education. So I focus on things like market-based reforms in education and what are the implications for equity and access. Yeah, so I've just returned from doing a Fulbright in New Zealand. There they have self-managed schools, so radical decentralization, a lot of autonomy at the school level. And I was quite interested in what's the impact on that for access for different students in different communities, because to some extent that takes the charter school model that we have here in the US and takes it to more of a logical extreme. And so my research on that has been looking at how those schools have policies for admissions, how they market themselves to different populations. So that's one thing I've been working on. But the major focus right now is I'm working on a project with a couple of the other fellows here, Liz DeBray and Janelle Scott, looking at how policymakers use research around education issues, and in particular how different intermediary organizations, think tanks, advocacy groups, how they shape the use of that research. They were able to kind of package and market forms of research evidence to policymakers to get them to advance a particular agenda. There has been much more attention to the achievement of different groups of students, which I think can be a good thing. It depends on how it's done and what the implications are for schools and for students. But things like No Child Left Behind have forced schools to pay more attention to how all types of students are succeeding or not succeeding. So that's important. But at the same time, we have to be concerned for equity reasons that the implications of having more of a consumer mentality often leaves behind the children that are most in need of help or most in need of access to quality options. So that's been a concern, and I think a lot of the research on school choice programs underlines that those kids are often left behind because they don't have necessarily strong advocates that are making consumer-style choices for them. So I'm really interested in the use of evidence, and as I mentioned, a project I'm working on right now looks at how policymakers are using evidence. And you're seeing quite a disconnect between what policymakers are saying and embracing on the one hand and what the research is suggesting are effective interventions. So I think that disconnect is quite interesting. And I would say the same thing is true with parents. A lot of these market-based models were forwarded under the assumption that parents would hold the schools accountable. They would only enroll their children in good schools that were effective academically. And when schools were failing to perform, parents would pull their kids out, and so there would be forms of market discipline on those schools. But we're not seeing that happen to the extent that was expected. And we see a lot of demonstrably bad schools that have waiting lists. Parents are still hoping to get their kids in there. So again, this question of evidence, it's important to consider what are parents looking for relative to what reformers were expecting that they would be pursuing.